Coming up on this special edition of the ICT Newscast, we look back on the stories that shined a light on the complex problem that is climate change. From the Maui fires that devastated the land and displaced thousands of indigenous Hawaiians, to an oil drilling project in Alaska approved against the wishes of hundreds of Alaska Native communities. And we also speak with Janine Yazzie, who gives us an overview of the United Nations Climate Summit in 2023. Join us for those stories and more from the ICT Newscast.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.
The ICT Newscast is sponsored by the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, a nonprofit organization serving American Indian nations and people in the recovery and control of their rightful homelands. On the web at iltf.org.
Support for the ICT Newscast with Aaliyah Chavez comes from the Arizona PBS studios in Phoenix at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communications at Arizona State University.
Thank you for joining us for this special edition of the ICT Newscast. 2023 was a year filled with extraordinary heat, wildfires, and other natural disasters. From ravaging fires in Hawaii to Canada's worst fire season on record, ICT takes a look back on the stories that showed the impact of climate change on our communities. In Alaska, climate change is changing how Alaska Natives practice their traditional ways of life. In response to this, 2 Alaska Natives created a collective to share and preserve salmon and other traditional foods. ICT's Jocelyn Estes talks to us more about this.
I wrote an introduction to a photo essay by Emily Sullivan, a great photographer, for High Country News. In it, I explained that the Arctic is warming at least twice as fast as other parts of the planet. And this is wreaking havoc. I mean, we're getting major storms, permafrost is melting and tilting buildings and that kind of thing. And warming waters are having serious effects, dire effects on salmon, which is a major food source, especially in rural Alaska, where people get 80% of their nutrition in a lot of villages. 80% of their nutrition comes from nature itself. So the same warming trend that is hitting the Yukon and Kuskokwim rivers really hard is having the opposite effect in Bristol Bay. So on the Yukon and Kuskokwim rivers, fisheries have been shut down or severely limited. On the other hand, Bristol Bay has had huge returns of salmon in the past year or so, 39 million sockeye salmon in 2023. So 2 women, Denali Chase Hodgson, who is Deg Hitan Dene and Sugpiaq, and Ruth Keeson Miller, who's Denina Athabaskan and a member of the Churyung tribe of Bethel, have come up with an idea to create a nonprofit collective, the Smokehouse Collective. And the idea is to take fish, for instance, from Bristol Bay and share it for free with families in the Yukon-Kuskokwim region. And this is going to be done with you respecting the animals that give themselves as food and the tradition of being generous and sharing food with others. The idea behind the Smokehouse Collective is to reinvigorate ancient indigenous trade practices, to redistribute wealth, to return land and water to indigenous stewardship, and show that a healthy economy and clean environment can coexist. Another issue is that kids are not going to fish camp in the summer, and they're not learning, so they're not being part of the extended family experience, and they're not learning how to put up fish for the winter. So the Smokehouse Collective wants to remedy that by, and I must say, the Smokehouse Collective is off to a strong start. They started fundraising in May, and they've already raised enough money to buy a portable fish processing plant, and they started to buy some land near Bristol Bay. And the goal is to have a communal fish processing plant, housing, gardens, a smokehouse, a kitchen, and to grow produce, to gather berries and other traditional foods. And all this is to create food security and food sovereignty, and to host families from the Yukon and Kuskokwim region and other regions that are facing the loss of salmon, so they can have the experience of harvesting and processing fish. So the collective has allies in this effort. One is fishermen who are willing to donate fish, and another group are pilots and airlines that are willing to help distribute fish to these hard-hit villages. So Miller calls all of this an investment in our resilience as Native peoples to persevere in our cultures despite the global impacts we're facing. Jocelyn Estes in Anchorage for ICT News.
A new UN report paints a grim picture of the state of our world, stating that humans are exploiting the Earth's natural resources to the point where we are reaching tipping points and possibly causing irreversible damage to the planet.
The study by the UN's think tank, the United Nations University, says we need to better manage the world's resources to avoid catastrophic impacts. Indeed, data from the last 12 months show temperatures that are the hottest ever recorded. A peer-reviewed report by the nonprofit Climate Central said burning gasoline, coal, natural gas, and other fossil fuels that release planet-warming gases like carbon dioxide caused the unnatural warming from November 2022 to October 2023. In September, Indian Collective called on the Biden administration to end the reliance on fossil fuels. And that is a complicated path for world governments. Jean Lahamacourt is an environmental advocate and a citizen of the Fort McKay First Nation.
What our Canadian leadership is doing is putting their blindfolders on and not really being accountable for what they have done, and yet they're portraying that Canada's environment friendly and all this, but this is the biggest source of the carbons here. Like, how can you say that?
Canada is among roughly 100 nations that have pledged by mid-century to reach zero emissions, or take as much greenhouse gas out of the atmosphere as it contributes. At last year's UN climate conference known as COP27, Canada also joined other rich nations to promise more money for developing countries to fight climate change. Yet, at that same conference, Canada brought the second largest delegation of fossil fuel executives of any country in the world, according to the Associated Press. The business of extraction mixed with the challenges of climate change.
The devastating wildfires of 2023 have been labeled as one of the deadliest wildfires in over a century, leaving over 100 dead and many more homeless. As you may remember, the Lahaina wildfire started as a brush fire fueled by high winds and dry grasses. A popular tourist attraction, Lahaina was also once the capital of the Kingdom of Hawaii. Both the San Manuel Band of Mission Indians in California and San Diego Pueblo in New Mexico provided relief to the residents of Hawaii, with San Manuel making a $125,000 contribution to the American Red Cross, while San Diego Pueblo pledged $1 million to the Maui Strong Fund of the Hawaii Community Foundation. In the midst of destruction, hope can be found as a group of Native Hawaiians have worked together to save a species of a tree that holds deep cultural significance to the island's history. ICT's Demi Dupavillon has a story.
Teams rushed to keep a famous banyan tree alive in the heart of Lahaina. It has been a tourist landmark and a symbol for outsiders. But there is another story, one that peels away a layer of colonialism. A small group of arborists, farmers, and landscapers argue that the attention given to the banyan tree was misplaced.
Seeing the banyan tree lifted up, which is a symbol of colonialism, was planted by an individual who was a key figure in the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom, is a symbol of, tourism and kind of Hawaii as America's playground, is a symbol of a lot of the things, the mistakes, I guess, that we're hoping are not repeated.
The fire also nearly wiped out another set of trees, ones that sustained Polynesian voyagers about 1,000 years ago. As Maui recovers from the deadliest U.S. wildfire in more than a century, some Hawaii natives have made it their mission to save these trees.
as our ancestors spread out across the islands, they were cloning these trees and moving them around. They're sterile, so you can't grow them from seed. So every pre-European ulu tree in Hawaii is believed to be a clone of itself. You know, these trees are not necessarily genetically unique, but they are unique in the sense that they hold the stories of that place.
Deep in the roots of badly burned specimens is live tissue that can be used to clone new ulu trees. Researchers believe they were carried across the ocean by Polynesian voyagers before arriving on the island. Ulu trees can grow to 60 feet tall and produce hundreds of pounds of breadfruit, typically eaten cooked with a starchy taste.
The work that we're trying to do is first and foremost to ensure that those historical trees live on and their genealogy lives on throughout the historical footprint of Lahaina.
That was ethnobotanist Hokuau Pellegrino, who has breadfruit trees on his farm in Waikapu. He believes reintegrating breadfruit into the terrain could reclaim the identity of the town and feed it too.
Yeah, it's so tasty. A little bit of paprika, Hawaiian salt. Oh, it's the best.
As plant life is found through the roots, samples are collected and sent to a lab at the University of Hawaii in Hilo. Lincoln projects hundreds of new trees could grow from seeds or saplings.
And so when a disaster like this happens and potentially wipes out the last remaining trees that date back to pre-contact times, that are a reminder that the Lahaina of today and the Lahaina of the past 100 years is not the Lahaina that was always there. It was quite different in the past, and that's really important to remember because it reminds us that it can be different in the future as well.
The groups saving these ulu trees are restoring Hawaiian values. They hold the history of Lahaina's past and hope for its future. Reporting for ICT News, I'm Demi Jupavian.
The blazes in Hawaii, of course, were not the only fires of 2023. In Canada, an unprecedented wildfire season sent choking smoke across much of the country and into the eastern United States and as far south as Texas. The fires displaced tens of thousands of Indigenous peoples from their homes in 94 First Nations, and those numbers don't include Inuit and Métis people. By year end, many people had returned home to try and rebuild, but thousands still remain evacuated, living in hotel rooms. Said Indigenous Services Minister Patty Hajdu, "We know that First Nations continue to be on the front line of climate change." The real-life impacts of a changing climate didn't stop there. In December, I traveled to Ottawa, which historically is a winter wonderland during the holiday season. Not this year. The famous Rideau Canal, once considered Canada's longest skating rink, is usually filled with skaters from around the world. This year, the water is open, and an iconic Canadian experience has been put on hold, thanks to a warming planet.
Indigenous communities are often the hardest hit by climate change disruptions. At this year's UN Climate Change Conference, known as COP28, held in Dubai, advocates worked to make sure that Indigenous voices were heard and heeded. The Indian Collective and the Indigenous Peoples Caucus hosted the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion at COP28. Together, they held more than 80 sessions at the conference. They worked to promote Indigenous-led solutions and a just transition from fossil fuels. But their goals didn't end there.
Our message while being here is to urge nation states and parties to implement and honor Indigenous rights and self-determination throughout all negotiations.
And that message and that work didn't end when COP28 ended. We caught up recently with Janine Yazzie from the Indian Collective, and she talked about the need to hold industrial developed nations responsible for climate change.
And so at the UN Forum on Climate Change, what is really being discussed is how those countries step into the responsibility of addressing the challenges and the issues created by climate change. And we are there to really push them to take responsibility for causing climate change. And for ensuring that they maintain strong commitments to doing everything that they can to limit temperature rise, because we know that Indigenous peoples all around the globe are on the forefront of many of these impacts and are the stewards of some of the world's remaining biological diversity that is made very vulnerable by what's happening with climate change and with the so-called solutions that countries are pursuing. And so what we saw coming out of COP was that Indigenous representation is extremely important and continues to see barriers and challenges. As an example, this year, there was about 350 registered Indigenous delegates. But in comparison, there are about over 2,100 oil and gas and fossil fuel lobbyists that were also present. And so we have a lot of work to do to continue to advance our visibility and enhance our participation in meaningful ways in these negotiations. We do know that everywhere that Indigenous peoples were able to show up, they held the lines in advocating for human rights and Indigenous peoples' rights and appropriate safeguards to be in place in everything from the development of climate financing mechanisms and funding mechanisms to the development of rules to govern international carbon trade markets. And these become really important because most people see and know and can understand that governments will do everything they can to preserve the status quo and to prevent any loss of profits or power, which can come into direct conflict with meaningful and effective action that's necessary for climate change. And so our priorities going forward is to continue to push and challenge power, entrenched power, in decision-making around climate finance and how these mechanisms, whether it's for loans, social impact investments, or through direct grant funding, to be able to show an alternative pathway that actually does support and uphold the self-determination of Indigenous peoples, and that leads to effective and meaningful investments into climate solutions in some of our most vulnerable ecosystems. Right now, for example, every pot of funding that's available and has been created by COP negotiations is only for the so-called global south or for so-called developing nations. And we know through history and through experience that these just become tools for neocolonialism and for creating debt and so-called developing countries that force open access for powerful transnational corporations and countries and elites in the north to be able to access resources, influence politics, influence economic development in these so-called developed nations. And so as Indigenous peoples and as Indian Collective, our goal is to kind of push back and challenge those practices because we know the history, we know how it's used, so that we can create better mechanisms that actually address the problems we're trying to address, that open up direct access for Indigenous peoples from all ecosystems, from all regions of the globe, and that ensure funding gets to where it needs to go without compromising the rights of self-determination of Indigenous peoples, because we know that those rights are very critical for the solutions that they're developing and have been developing on the front lines of climate change all across the globe.
We circle back to Alaska, where in March 2023, environmentalists were speaking out against what's being called the Willow project from oil producer ConocoPhillips. The Willow project is estimated to produce 180,000 barrels of oil per day, and it would generate billions of dollars for the federal government, the state of Alaska, and the North Slope Borough. The proposal is expected to span across a 30-year time frame. It would be located on federal land within the National Petroleum Reserve in Alaska. The Alaska State House of Representatives voted unanimously to support the project. The Bureau of Land Management said it will allow 3 sites rich in petroleum to be drilled that would result in around 199 total wells. The 2 other drilling sites proposed for the project were denied. Project developer ConocoPhillips called the decision workable and said it is the right decision for Alaska and our nation. This order is one of the most significant since Interior Secretary Deb Haaland has been in office. The order was not signed by Haaland herself, but rather by her deputy Tom Bedreau, who grew up in Alaska and has a close relationship with state lawmakers. Haaland was notably silent on the project, which she had previously opposed as a New Mexico congresswoman. Candy White, a program manager from the Indigenous Environmental Network, spoke to ICT.
My heart goes out. I'm starting to get emotional because, there's elders that have fought for so long, and it's like he just shoved them off a cliff. That's what it feels like, because they don't know what it's like to live there, and they're making assumptions that people are going to be okay if you throw some money at it. And money has always been the problem.
Some Alaska Native leaders were in favor of the project, including Alaska Representative Mary Peltola. She tweeted, "I campaigned on getting Willow done because I knew we needed it. We must reverse Alaska's economic decline. Today, the Biden administration made the right choice and put real energy progress over absolutism." The Willow project could produce up to 180,000 barrels of oil a day, create up to 2,500 jobs during construction, and generate billions of dollars in royalties for federal, state, and local governments. In September, the Associated Press reported that Indigenous communities are facing some of the most severe conditions associated with climate change. But since 2016, people from 70 tribes have been coming together to find innovative ways to connect with each other and to share ideas about how the practice of culture can be a tool to manage the impacts of climate change. ICT's Jack Orleans has this report.
Native people are increasingly finding innovative ways to connect with each other and to find solidarity to combat climate change. Across the country, Indigenous groups are connecting to share stories about a changing climate. Climate camps have propped up to provide a platform for solidarity and a discourse on how to serve the planet. The camps drew inspiration from climate boot camps in the Northwest that weren't Indigenous affiliated. The camps combined climate education along with passing down traditional stories and skills that would usually be more reserved to select members of the tribes, such as basket weaving. The climate camps have occurred almost every year since 2016.
There used to be like a 4 to 6 week period that you could harvest cedar. Now it's down to like 1 week.
The Biden administration has opened up $720 million through the Inflation Reduction Act to help Native American tribes adapt to climate change. However, some say all of these new opportunities have been overwhelming when juggling everything else. Since settlers moved 99% of Native people off their ancestral land, they're now most often in places more prone to the more disastrous effects of the looming climate disaster. These camps have provided a means of community support.
I mean, I've been doing this work for quite a while, and sometimes I feel kind of guilty because I come to get re-energized.
Indigenous tribes in the area have been making headway into preserving the environment, however. The tone at Climate Camp this year was a bit more celebratory. A beach was recently able to expand because of the removal of the dam on the Elwha River. It was impeding a salmon run. The dam had taken decades to dismantle, and now it's finally gone, and the fish are returning to spawn.
Just hearing one tribe coming together and just working hard to, have their salmon run, to get the food back, to have the water. It's just amazing that they're able to use their voices.
It's not all doom and gloom. The Jamestown S'Klallam and the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation are competing to see which one can become carbon neutral by 2032. This is how the new community is being discovered at the camp. In Phoenix, Arizona, Jack Orleans, ICT News.
And that's a slice for Indigenous World. For all the latest, visit ictnews.org. To all of us in the newsroom, stay safe, my relatives.
This program is made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people.